Black single mom humiliated in first class, one call grounds entire flight. Jasmine had always dreamed of a better life for herself and her son, Marcus. As a single mother, her days were filled with work, taking care of her son and juggling countless responsibilities. But she never let these challenges stop her. She knew that if she wanted to give Marcus the best future, she had to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard it got. She worked as a marketing manager for a growing company. Her job was demanding, but it paid well, and she had worked hard to get there. She didn't take any opportunity for granted. Every promotion, every new task was a step closer to her goal. Her coworkers admired her dedication, but Jasmine didn't have time to celebrate her successes. Every free moment she had, she spent with Marcus, making sure he was doing well in school and had everything he needed. For years, Jasmine dreamed of taking a break. She had sacrificed so much to build a future for Marcus, and while she was proud of what she had accomplished, she felt like she was running on empty. She needed to do something for herself, something that would remind her that she was more than just a mother and a worker. She had always wanted to travel, to see the world outside her small circle, and perhaps even experience the luxury of a first-class flight, something she had only heard of in movies and books. One day, after a long stretch of hard work and sleepless nights, Jasmine finally got a break. The company was sending her on a business trip to meet with clients in another city. The best part? She had been upgraded to first class. It was a big deal for Jasmine. It wasn't just about the fancy seat or the gourmet food. It was about the recognition of her hard work, the reward for all those late nights and early mornings. She felt like she had earned this moment. When the day of her flight arrived, Jasmine was filled with excitement. She carefully packed her suitcase, making sure everything was in order for the trip. She didn't have to worry about Marcus. He was staying with his grandmother for a few days. Jasmine felt a twinge of guilt for being away from him, but she knew this trip would help her career and, in the long run, benefit both of them. At the airport, Jasmine could hardly believe her luck when she walked through the first-class entrance. The luxurious lounge, with its comfortable chairs and quiet atmosphere, was a far cry from the crowded, noisy gates she was used to. She sat down, waiting for her flight to board, feeling a sense of pride. This was her moment. When it was time to board, Jasmine made her way to the gate, where a flight attendant checked her ticket and led her down the jet bridge. As she entered the plane, she could see the difference between first class and economy. The seats were wide with extra legroom, and the cabin had a calm, quiet atmosphere. She settled into her seat, feeling a little out of place but also proud. This was the life she had worked for. She took a moment to take in the surroundings, the soft lighting, the plush seats, and the calm, quiet chatter of the other passengers. As she looked around, she noticed that most of the passengers around her were white, and many of them appeared to be business people. Jasmine tried to push the thought out of her mind. She wasn't here to judge anyone, she was here to enjoy her hard-earned reward. The flight attendants came around, offering drinks and snacks. Jasmine smiled politely as they passed by her, and she ordered a glass of water. The flight attendants were cordial, but they didn't seem particularly friendly. She brushed it off. After all, they were busy, and she wasn't used to this level of service. She was just grateful to be there. As the flight took off, Jasmine leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines relax her. She had worked so hard to get here, and now, for the first time in a long time, she could relax and breathe. She thought about Marcus and how proud he would be to know that his mother was on a first-class flight. It wasn't just for her, it was for him too. She was doing this for both of them. The flight continued smoothly, and Jasmine allowed herself to enjoy the little things: the comfortable seat, the food served on a real plate, the attention from the staff, even if it was brief. She was still getting used to the idea that she was living a moment she had once only dreamed of. It felt surreal, but at the same time, it was exactly where she deserved to be. However, as the flight continued, Jasmine started to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. At first, it was just little things. She noticed that the flight attendants were spending more time with the passengers in the seats around her, but were passing by her without much attention. It wasn't that they were rude, but there was a clear difference in how they interacted with her compared to the other first-class passengers. She didn't want to assume anything, so she tried to ignore it, thinking perhaps she was just being overly sensitive. But as the flight went on, the feeling of being overlooked grew. Jasmine felt like she was invisible, as though she didn't quite belong in the luxury of first class. She tried to tell herself it was all in her head. After all, she had worked hard to get there. She deserved to be treated the same as everyone else. But the thought lingered in the back of her mind, making her uncomfortable. It wasn't until the flight attendants made a clear effort to serve the other passengers before her that Jasmine couldn't ignore it any longer. She was polite, as she always was, and smiled when the attendants finally came to her row. But inside, she felt a simmering frustration. Why was she being treated differently? Was it because she was a black woman? Or because she was sitting alone rather than with a colleague or a family member? The thought unsettled her, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. She kept trying to shake off the feeling. It was just a flight, she told herself. It didn't matter. But deep down, Jasmine knew that it did matter. It mattered because this wasn't just about bad service. This was about how she was being seen. Or rather, how she wasn't being seen at all. As the flight continued, Jasmine became more aware of the subtle differences in how she was being treated. She felt herself shrinking into her seat, hoping to blend in, hoping to avoid any further attention. But the discomfort grew with every passing moment. She was a successful, strong woman who had worked her way up to this point, and yet here she was, being made to feel like she didn't belong. Jasmine didn't want to let it get to her, but the sense of exclusion was too strong to ignore. She had been excited about this experience, but now, it felt more like a reminder of how hard it could be to find her place in spaces where people like her were few and far between. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had earned this. She was strong. She belonged here. Little did she know, this flight would not only challenge her sense of self-worth, but it would also set the stage for a much bigger confrontation, one that would force her to stand up for herself in a way she never had before. As the hours passed, Jasmine tried to keep her focus on the flight and the peaceful feeling that came with being in first class. She was determined not to let the little discomforts get to her. After all, she had earned this experience. She had worked tirelessly to get where she was, and today was supposed to be about celebrating that hard work. But it became increasingly difficult to ignore the treatment she was receiving. The flight attendants were kind to the other passengers, offering them drinks and snacks with a smile. But when they got to Jasmine, it was as though they were rushing through the motions. She would ask for a drink or a snack, and they would nod politely, only to return much later than they did for the other passengers. It wasn't that they were being outright rude, but Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She didn't want to jump to conclusions. She told herself it was probably nothing. Maybe the flight attendants were just busy, or maybe she was imagining things. But the more she thought about it, the more it felt like a subtle form of neglect. As the hours wore on, she found herself becoming more and more aware of how different the service was for her compared to the other passengers. When a flight attendant finally approached her, Jasmine politely asked for a refill of her water. She smiled, trying to make the best of the situation. The attendant nodded and walked away, only to return after what felt like an eternity with a half-hearted smile and a quick, almost dismissive, refill of her glass. Jasmine tried not to let it bother her. She had always prided herself on staying calm and composed, no matter the situation. But this was different. It wasn't just the slow service. It was the way she was being treated, as though she was invisible, as though she didn't belong in this luxurious section of the plane. She looked around at the other passengers, most of whom were absorbed in their own conversations or the movies playing on their screens. The few that weren't seemed to be given special attention, while Jasmine was left to sit quietly, feeling more and more out of place. It wasn't just the service that made her uncomfortable, it was the way the other passengers treated her, or rather, the way they didn't. No one spoke to her, and it seemed like everyone around her had their own group to talk to, their own place in the world. Jasmine couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this carefully curated environment. She was used to being alone, to standing on her own 2 feet, but being alone in this moment felt different. It felt isolating. As the flight continued, Jasmine couldn't help but overhear conversations between the other passengers. They spoke freely, laughing and sharing stories, their voices carrying through the quiet cabin. Some of them exchanged pleasantries with the flight attendants, who smiled and responded warmly. But Jasmine didn't engage. She didn't feel like she had the right to interrupt or ask for the same level of attention. She had been raised to be independent and self-sufficient, and so she simply sat quietly, pretending to enjoy the luxury of first class. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. She thought back to all the times she had worked hard to prove herself, to show that she was just as worthy of respect as anyone else. She had climbed the corporate ladder, overcoming challenges and breaking barriers along the way. And now, here she was, sitting in the most exclusive part of the plane, and yet she felt like she wasn't even seen. The moment when the flight attendant passed her by again was the tipping point. It wasn't even a particularly glaring incident. It was just the same routine, the same lack of attention. Jasmine was asked if she wanted anything, and when she requested a blanket, the attendant merely nodded and walked away without offering any further assistance. It was a small thing, but for Jasmine, it felt like a punch in the gut. Her mind started to race. Was it because she was a single mother? Was it because she was black? She couldn't tell, but something about the way she was treated felt like it had nothing to do with her. It was as though she was being judged for something she had no control over. The thought made her stomach turn. She had fought so hard to make a life for herself, to prove that she was just as capable, just as deserving of success as anyone else. But here she was in first class, feeling less than the person sitting next to her. Jasmine looked around again. The other passengers didn't seem to notice her discomfort. They were absorbed in their own little worlds, talking to each other, enjoying their drinks and laughing. For them, it was just another flight. For Jasmine, it was a test of patience and self-worth. She had worked so hard to get here, and yet in this moment she felt like an afterthought, a passenger who didn't matter. The more she thought about it, the more Jasmine realized that this wasn't just about poor service. It was about being seen. It was about the invisible walls that had been built around her, walls that separated her from the people around her. She had spent so much of her life fighting against the odds, pushing through barriers and striving for success. But now, she was faced with a different kind of challenge, one that wasn't about hard work or ambition, but about something deeper, something more ingrained in society. Jasmine tried to shake off the feeling. She wasn't going to let this ruin her experience. She had earned this moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. She couldn't help but wonder why she was being treated this way. Was it just the flight attendants? Or was it something more? Was it the way people saw her, the assumptions they made before she even spoke? By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Jasmine was feeling increasingly uncomfortable. She tried to focus on the in-flight entertainment, but her mind kept drifting back to the treatment she was receiving. She looked at the other passengers, who seemed to be enjoying their meal or chatting comfortably with each other, and she felt a pang of loneliness. She didn't want to be the person who called attention to herself, who made waves. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she deserved more than this. She deserved the same respect and attention as anyone else. The more she thought about it, the more Jasmine realized that she wasn't just upset about the way she was treated on this flight. It was a pattern she had seen time and time again in her life, being overlooked, being made to feel like she didn't belong, like she wasn't good enough. It wasn't just the flight attendants. It was the world she had been navigating for so long. And today, in this moment, it felt like that world had come crashing down on her, reminding her of all the struggles she had faced and the ones she still had to overcome. As the flight continued, Jasmine made a decision. She wasn't going to let this experience define her. She would not let this moment, this flight, break her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let anyone make her feel less than the person she was. Jasmine wasn't just a single mother, a woman of color, or someone who had fought to get here. She was a strong, capable woman who deserved to be seen, respected, and treated with dignity. And in that moment, Jasmine made a vow to herself. No matter what happened next, she would stand tall, speak up, and never let anyone make her feel like she didn't belong. Not on this flight, not in her career, and certainly not in her life. As the flight continued, Jasmine's frustration grew with each passing minute. At first, she tried to convince herself that the service was simply an oversight, that the flight attendants were just busy and hadn't meant to make her feel overlooked. But the longer the flight went on, the more it became clear that this was something deeper. It wasn't just bad service, it was an intentional disregard, a subtle yet unmistakable form of exclusion. Every time the flight attendants walked past her, they seemed to hurry by. Whenever she raised her hand for assistance, it felt like it took forever for anyone to acknowledge her request. She couldn't help but compare how they treated the other passengers around her. They would walk over, smile, and engage in friendly conversation with them. Yet when it came to her, they seemed to brush her off as though she didn't deserve the same level of attention. Jasmine felt a growing sense of unease. She was no stranger to feeling like an outsider. Throughout her life, there had always been moments when she felt out of place. But this was different. This was happening in a space that was supposed to be a reward for her hard work, a place where she was supposed to feel comfortable and respected. But instead, she felt invisible. She tried to focus on the in-flight entertainment, hoping it would distract her. But even that felt distant. The movies didn't interest her, and the music didn't soothe her the way it normally would. Everything felt disconnected, as though she was floating in a bubble of discomfort that she couldn't escape. The hum of the airplane engines, the clinking of glasses, the soft conversations of the other passengers, they all seemed to intensify her sense of isolation. Jasmine glanced around the cabin. The first-class section was full of well-dressed people, most of them absorbed in their own worlds. Some were reading, others were talking to each other, and a few were working on laptops. Jasmine felt a pang of loneliness as she realized that, for all her achievements, she still felt like she didn't belong in this space. She had worked so hard to get here, to earn this moment of luxury, but now it felt like it had been tainted by the way she was being treated. The worst part was that no one seemed to notice. None of the other passengers looked her way or acknowledged her discomfort. They were all too absorbed in their own little bubbles of privilege. Jasmine could see it in their faces, people who had probably been flying first class for years, who took it for granted, who didn't think twice about the service they received. They never had to question whether they belonged. They were comfortable as if the world had always catered to them. For Jasmine, it was a different story. She had spent her entire life fighting for every opportunity she had. She had fought against prejudice, against stereotypes, and against the belief that people like her didn't belong in spaces like this. She had climbed the ladder of success step by step, never giving up, always pushing forward, always proving that she was just as capable as anyone else. But in this moment, it felt like none of that mattered. All her hard work, all her sacrifices, all her struggles, it felt like they were worth nothing. She glanced down at her hands, the same hands that had typed out countless emails, signed endless contracts, and worked late into the night to build a career for herself and a future for Marcus. Those hands had built her success, and yet now they felt small, insignificant in the face of the treatment she was receiving. She clenched them into fists, trying to suppress the anger that was rising within her. But it wasn't just anger. It was a deep, gnawing frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. As the flight attendants continued to ignore her, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of powerlessness. She had always prided herself on being independent, on handling things on her own. But in this moment, she realized that her success didn't protect her from the biases and prejudices that others might hold. She had always believed that hard work would be enough, that if she proved herself, she would be treated fairly. But now, in the face of this subtle discrimination, she began to question everything she had worked for. Was it enough? Did the world really see her for who she was, or was she always going to be judged by the color of her skin, her gender, or her status as a single mother? The longer she sat there, the more the weight of the situation began to press down on her. She had been patient, had tried to brush off the little slights, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. She felt like she was being silenced, like her voice didn't matter, like her presence on this flight wasn't as important as anyone else's. The idea that someone could make her feel like this in a space she had worked so hard to be in was maddening. And then it happened. The flight attendant came by, holding a tray of drinks. She smiled at the passenger next to Jasmine, offering him a choice of beverages. Jasmine raised her hand, hoping this time she would be acknowledged. But instead of the attendant walking over to her with the same courtesy, she simply walked past, offering a polite nod and continuing down the aisle. That was the moment Jasmine knew she couldn't stay quiet any longer. She had tried to be patient, tried to let it go, but it was clear that things weren't going to change on their own. She wasn't going to sit here and allow herself to be treated as though she didn't matter. Jasmine had spent too many years fighting for the life she had to let this moment slide by without saying something. She straightened up in her seat, taking a deep breath. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she knew this was the moment when she needed to speak up. She couldn't let this injustice continue, not just for her own sake, but for all the people who had been treated like this before her and would be treated like this after her. Jasmine pressed the call button. The moment the light turned on, the flight attendant came over, this time with a forced smile. "Yes, how can I help you?" she asked, her tone barely masking her annoyance. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Jasmine said firmly. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it, something that made the attendant pause for a moment. Jasmine wasn't going to let this slide any longer. She wasn't going to let herself be dismissed, not by anyone. The attendant hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll let the supervisor know." As she walked away, Jasmine felt a wave of determination wash over her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she was done being quiet. She had every right to be here just as much as anyone else. She had earned her seat in first class, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel like she didn't belong. The flight attendant returned with the supervisor, a middle-aged man who looked uncomfortable with the situation. Jasmine explained what had been happening: the slow service, the dismissive attitude, the feeling of being invisible, and the supervisor listened quietly, nodding every now and then. When she finished, he apologized, but his words felt hollow. Jasmine didn't need an apology, she needed change. But for now, all she could do was speak up and hope that her voice would make a difference. She wasn't sure if the situation would improve on this flight, but she knew that she had taken the first step. She had stood up for herself, and that in itself was a victory. The moment Jasmine pressed the call button, a sense of determination flooded over her. She had been sitting quietly, tolerating the mistreatment for far too long, but now she was ready to make her voice heard. She had always prided herself on handling situations with grace and patience, but this time, things were different. This was about more than just poor service. It was about being seen and respected, something she had worked tirelessly for all her life. The flight attendant's response was quick, almost too quick, as if she were eager to avoid further confrontation. She walked toward Jasmine with a forced smile, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew what was coming. The attendant's fake politeness only fueled Jasmine's resolve. She wasn't going to let this go any longer. "Yes, how can I assist you?" the flight attendant asked, her voice light but laced with tension. She wasn't expecting this, Jasmine could tell. Jasmine took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I would like to speak with your supervisor," she said calmly. Her tone was firm but not hostile. She didn't need to raise her voice. The strength in her words spoke volumes on its own. The flight attendant paused, her face betraying a hint of discomfort before nodding. "I'll let him know." She turned and walked away without another word, leaving Jasmine to sit back in her seat, waiting for the supervisor to arrive. Her heart pounded, but there was a sense of calm now. She wasn't going to let this situation defeat her. As the minutes passed, Jasmine could feel the weight of the other passengers' glances on her. Some looked curiously, some disinterested, and others seemed uncomfortable with the tension. She could sense that there was a quiet ripple of awareness spreading through the cabin. She had made a stand, and now everyone could feel it. It wasn't just the flight attendants or the passengers that Jasmine was concerned about. She was doing this for herself, for every time she had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It wasn't just about getting the service she deserved on this flight. It was about standing up for the dignity she knew she was entitled to. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for every person who had ever been treated as less than. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor arrived. He was a middle-aged man, well-dressed in a neat suit, his name tag reading Mr. Hayes. He walked over to Jasmine's seat, his expression polite but cautious, as if he were unsure of how to approach the situation. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Mr. Hayes, the supervisor. How can I help you?" he asked, his voice soft but professional. Jasmine took a deep breath before speaking again. This was it, the moment when she could explain what had been happening, the moment she could finally be heard. "I've been on this flight for several hours now," she began, her voice steady. "And I've noticed that I've been treated differently than the other passengers in first class. I've had to wait for basic service, like drinks and snacks, much longer than anyone else. I've been ignored while other passengers around me have been attended to. I feel like I'm invisible, like I don't matter." Mr. Hayes listened intently, his face betraying no emotion as he processed her words. Jasmine could see that he was taking her complaint seriously, but she wasn't sure if he understood the full weight of what she was saying. This wasn't just about slow service. This was about something deeper, the way she had been made to feel less than, as though her presence in that space wasn't important. "I'm very sorry to hear that, ma'am," he said after a moment, his voice sincere but almost too rehearsed. "That is certainly not the standard of service we aim to provide. I'll look into this right away and make sure the crew is made aware of your concerns." Jasmine nodded, but inside she felt a sense of skepticism creeping in. She had heard this kind of apology before, empty words meant to diffuse the situation without actually addressing the problem. She didn't want an apology, she wanted action. She wanted the flight attendants to understand that this kind of treatment was unacceptable, that she was just as deserving of respect as anyone else on this flight. "I appreciate the apology," she said, her voice calm but firm, "but I don't think this is just about bad service. This is about how I'm being treated. I've had to sit here for hours, watching other passengers being treated with courtesy and care while I've been ignored. I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm the one being overlooked." Mr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably but nodded again. "I understand, ma'am. I will speak with the flight attendants and make sure they are more attentive. Your concerns will be addressed." Jasmine didn't want to just be placated with empty promises. "I want to be sure that this is taken seriously. I've worked hard to get to this point in my life, and I'm not going to let anyone make me feel like I don't belong here. I've earned my place in first class just like anyone else." The supervisor looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady but thoughtful. Finally, he nodded. "I understand. I will make sure this situation is handled appropriately. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. We don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or disrespected." Jasmine could tell that he meant well, but part of her was still skeptical. She had heard promises like this before, and they didn't always result in change. She didn't want to be just another passenger who had a complaint filed away without any real consequences. But for now, all she could do was trust that her words would have some effect. "Mr. Hayes gave her a polite nod before turning to walk away. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am. I'll make sure everything is sorted." As he left, Jasmine sat back in her seat, her mind racing. She had done what she needed to do. She had spoken up and she had been heard. But the feeling of unease hadn't left her. She still didn't know if the situation would change, if the flight attendants would actually treat her with the respect she deserved, or if this would just be another moment of token acknowledgement without any real follow-through. Jasmine's thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendant returned to the aisle. This time, she didn't pass by without a word. She stopped and smiled at Jasmine, though it wasn't as warm as it could have been. She apologized for the delay in service and promised that things would improve. Jasmine nodded but remained silent. The apology, though appreciated, felt too little too late. For the rest of the flight, the service did improve, but the damage had been done. Jasmine knew that she had made a stand, that she had forced a conversation that was long overdue. But as the flight continued toward its destination, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one bad experience. It was a reflection of a much larger issue. A world where people like her had to constantly prove that they belonged, that they were worthy of respect and dignity. As the plane descended toward the runway, Jasmine took a deep breath and looked out the window. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had taken a powerful step forward. This was only the beginning. As the plane descended toward its destination, Jasmine couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Her mind was still racing, processing the events of the flight. She had never expected to find herself in this situation. All she had wanted was a peaceful journey, a reward for her hard work, but what she had experienced was anything but that. Even though the service had improved slightly after speaking with the supervisor, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. The tension between her and the flight attendants hadn't fully dissipated, and she couldn't ignore the fact that she had been treated differently from the very start. She had been pushed aside, made to feel like she didn't belong in first class, as though her presence there wasn't as important as that of the other passengers. The small, subtle acts of exclusion still gnawed at her. They didn't just reflect poor service, they reflected something deeper, something systemic that she couldn't ignore. Jasmine looked out the window, watching as the plane began its descent into the city. The lights below twinkled like a sea of stars, a reminder of the world outside the confines of the plane. It felt so far away from everything that had just happened. For a brief moment, Jasmine let herself be distracted by the beauty of the city coming into view. It was almost as though the distance from the ground gave her a sense of peace, a temporary escape from the frustration and disappointment that still simmered inside her. The plane touched down smoothly, and the familiar hum of the engines quieted. The passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings as the captain made his final announcements. As the seatbelt signs turned off, Jasmine remained seated for a moment, taking a deep breath. She felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The ordeal was over, but the emotions it had stirred up were still fresh. The flight attendants moved about the cabin, collecting empty cups and wrappers, but Jasmine remained focused on the task at hand. It was time to get off the plane, gather her things, and move on to the next step of her journey. As the passengers filed off the plane, Jasmine walked down the aisle toward the exit. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some of them giving her a sympathetic look, others avoiding eye contact altogether. But Jasmine didn't care. She had done what she needed to do. She had spoken up and she had been heard. That was enough for her. Once she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, Jasmine took a moment to collect herself. She had a meeting to attend, and she couldn't afford to let this situation define her. She had bigger things to focus on. But as she walked through the terminal, the impact of what had happened started to settle in. She had spent so much time trying to prove herself, to show the world that she belonged, and yet here she was, still fighting for the same respect that others received without question. She thought about the other passengers she had seen on the flight, the ones who had never been made to feel out of place. They didn't have to fight for their seat at the table. They didn't have to constantly prove that they were just as deserving of respect, just as deserving of kindness as anyone else. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality Jasmine faced every day. Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew that the world wasn't always fair, and that her struggles were not unique. There were millions of people, particularly black women, who faced similar challenges every day. They were often overlooked, ignored, or treated as if they didn't belong. It wasn't just on airplanes, it was in boardrooms, classrooms, and offices around the world. Jasmine had learned to cope with it, to push through it. But today, she realized something important. She didn't have to cope with it anymore. She didn't have to accept being treated as less than. As she walked through the airport, she took out her phone and sent a quick message to Marcus, her son. She told him she was on her way and that she couldn't wait to see him. Marcus was always her motivation. Every decision she made, every sacrifice she made was for him. Jasmine wanted to be a role model for him, to show him that no matter how difficult life could get, you could always rise above it. She wanted him to understand that he, too, had the power to stand up for himself when he was treated unfairly. The more she thought about it, the more Jasmine realized that this experience had shown her something valuable. She had always known that her journey was different from others, but now she saw that it wasn't just about her struggles. It was about the example she set for others, especially her son. Her voice mattered. Her experiences mattered. And she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel like they didn't. Jasmine made her way to the taxi stand, still deep in thought. The events of the flight had shaken her, but she wasn't going to let them define her. She had done what she could in that moment, and now it was time to focus on the future. She wasn't going to dwell on the unfairness she had faced. She was going to use it as fuel to push forward, to continue building her life and her career. She had worked too hard to let one bad experience hold her back. As she sat in the back of the taxi, Jasmine couldn't help but smile. The city was alive, buzzing with energy, and so was she. The encounter on the flight hadn't broken her, it had only made her stronger. It had reminded her that she was worthy of respect, that her voice deserved to be heard, and that she was not alone in this fight. There were others who had been through similar experiences, and together they could create change. She was part of a larger movement, a movement toward equality, respect, and dignity for everyone. Jasmine arrived at her destination and stepped out of the taxi, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready for whatever the day would bring. She had faced an injustice, but she hadn't let it defeat her. She had stood up for herself, and that was something she could be proud of. The meeting went smoothly, and Jasmine felt a sense of accomplishment as she wrapped it up. But even as she celebrated her professional success, the events of the flight remained with her. They had changed her in a way she hadn't expected, pushing her to take a deeper look at the world around her and how she could be part of changing it. It wasn't just about getting the respect she deserved. It was about making sure that others received it too. By the time she made her way back to the hotel, Jasmine had already made up her mind. She would not let this moment define her, but she would use it to fuel her journey. She would continue to fight for fairness, for dignity, and for the respect that everyone deserved, no matter their background or appearance. And as she lay in bed that night, exhausted but satisfied, Jasmine knew that this was just the beginning. The world was waiting for her to make her mark, and she was ready to rise to the challenge. Jasmine woke up the next morning feeling different. The events of the previous day, the confrontation on the flight, the apology from the supervisor, and the realization that she had taken a stand for herself, were still fresh in her mind. It wasn't just the discomfort from being treated unfairly. It was the feeling of empowerment that had followed. As the morning sun filtered through the window of her hotel room, Jasmine felt a sense of clarity that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm and composed, no matter the situation. But yesterday had been a turning point. She had learned that silence, no matter how dignified, didn't always lead to change. Sometimes you had to speak up, even when it was uncomfortable. She had seen firsthand that when she stood up for herself, she not only reclaimed her dignity but also sparked a potential for change, not just for her, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. As she sat by the window, sipping her coffee, Jasmine thought about how many times in her life she had let things slide. How many times she had been silent, thinking it was easier to let small things go, to avoid confrontation. But the truth was, those small things had added up over time, building a wall of frustration that she could no longer ignore. Yesterday, that wall had finally cracked. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a one-time experience. This was part of a larger pattern. The discrimination she had faced on the flight wasn't just about the treatment she received on that plane. It was about the attitudes that existed in the world, attitudes that marginalized people like her. She wasn't alone in this. She thought about the many others who had faced similar challenges, who had been overlooked, underestimated, and made to feel like they didn't belong. It wasn't just about her, it was about all of them. Jasmine had grown up in a world that often made her feel like she had to prove herself more than others, as if her worth was something that had to be earned constantly. She had worked hard her entire life, never asking for special treatment, but always striving to prove that she was capable, that she deserved success. She had pushed through barriers, both visible and invisible, and she had done so with grace. But now, after yesterday's experience, she realized that grace didn't always have to mean silence. Grace could also mean standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. It was about using her voice to speak for herself and for others who couldn't. As Jasmine prepared for her meeting later that day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had a message to carry, not just for herself, but for the people who had been made to feel invisible. She wasn't going to let anyone take away her voice, her worth, or her place in this world. By the time she arrived at the meeting, Jasmine was ready. She walked into the conference room with confidence, her head held high, her shoulders back. The same strength that had carried her through countless challenges now flowed through her. She wasn't just going to sit quietly and accept the status quo. She was there to make her mark, to prove that she belonged not just in this meeting, but in every room she entered. The meeting itself went smoothly. Jasmine spoke clearly and with authority, presenting her ideas and contributing to the conversation. She wasn't afraid to take up space or to assert her perspective. She was there to be heard, and that's exactly what she did. By the end of the meeting, her colleagues had a new respect for her, not just because of her ideas, but because of the way she carried herself. She wasn't just a professional. She was a woman who knew her worth, and that confidence radiated. As the day wore on, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The events of the previous day had left her with more than just a story to tell. They had left her with a sense of power, a power she had been holding back for too long. She realized that she didn't need anyone's permission to take up space, to be heard, or to demand respect. She had the right to stand tall, to be seen and acknowledged for all that she had achieved and all that she was. The evening came quickly, and as Jasmine sat down to dinner, she reflected on how far she had come. She had grown up believing that she had to prove herself, that she had to work twice as hard to earn the respect of others. But now she knew that respect wasn't something that had to be earned. It was something that should be given freely. And if it wasn't, then it was up to her to take it, to claim it for herself. Jasmine thought about Marcus, her son, and how she wanted to teach him the same lessons. She wanted him to know that he was worthy of respect, that his voice mattered, and that he had the power to stand up for himself. She wanted him to grow up in a world where he didn't have to fight for his place, where he didn't have to prove his worth over and over again. But even if that world didn't exist just yet, she would teach him how to navigate it with confidence, with the knowledge that he had every right to take up space and to be heard. As the days passed, Jasmine's confidence continued to grow. She found herself standing taller, speaking up more often, and demanding the respect she had always deserved. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments when doubt crept in, when she questioned whether she was being too outspoken or too bold. But every time she hesitated, she remembered the events of that flight, the feeling of being invisible, of being overlooked, and she knew that she couldn't go back to being silent. Jasmine's experience on that plane had been uncomfortable, but it had been a catalyst for change. It had forced her to confront the biases that still existed in the world and to take a stand against them. It had reminded her that silence was not always the answer, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was speak up. She wasn't just a single mother trying to make a living. She wasn't just a woman who had to work twice as hard to be seen. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who knew her worth and was willing to fight for it. And that was something no one could take away from her. By the time she returned home, Jasmine felt like a different person. The events of the flight had sparked something inside her, something that had been there all along but had been buried under years of conditioning and self-doubt. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to lose it. As she opened the door to her home and Marcus ran to greet her, Jasmine knew that everything had changed. She had done this for him, for herself, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. She had taken a stand, and that was just the beginning. The world had a lot to offer, and Jasmine was ready to take it on, one step at a time.